Hi there, in this video we're going to look at computer audio in a little bit more depth before we get into recording. Now to do that we're going to spend most of this video looking at the preference window, so there won't be a lot of action on screen, but there will be a lot of information. So to get to the preference window, if you're on a Macintosh, that is in the live menu, or the shortcut is Command comma, and if you're on a PC that's going to be in the option window and your shortcut will be listed there as well. So let's hit Command comma, and here is the preference window. Now, if you recall from the last video, there are tabs on the left-hand side of the preference window dealing with specific aspects of live. And we're going to want to be looking at audio again, because that's what we're going to be dealing with, computer audio. This is also where in the last video I showed you how to set up your audio device. This is your digital audio interface and how to configure your input and output channels. Now we're going to look at sample rate and latency. Sample rate is the quality of your recording. And a sample is a very, very, very fast sound recording that's very short. And when these are assembled and put together in a stream of samples, the mind is tricked and we hear them as a continuous flow of audio. You can think of a sample like a frame in a movie, and as the movie is played back in front of you, each of these single images is seen as a continuous flow of motion, not a single frame. Now, how many samples per second are needed for the brain to perceive these samples as being continuous? Well, when I record at a rate of 48,000 samples per second. And that seems very high, but that's a very standard sample rate. Now, to put this into some perspective, compact disc audio, CD quality audio, it is recorded at 44,100 samples per second, what's called 44.1. So that's a CD. So we're already at 48 recording at a better quality than a CD. Now, live will let you go higher, and so thus, yes, you'll get a nicer quality, but it'll also make the file sizes of your audio files very, very, very big, and they will take up a lot of space on your hard drive. So I tend to go with 48K. It's a really good standard. A lot of people use it, and it gives you a lot of clarity and richness, and it doesn't take up a lot of size in your file and on your hard drive. Now for the default sound recording and pitch conversion, I just leave those at high quality. That's what we want, so that's the default, so let's just leave it there. Now let's talk about latency. Well, first off, what is latency? Latency is the term that is used for the time it takes for a person to play an instrument into a mic, have that go into your digital audio interface, then into the computer, have the computer analyze it, throw that information back to the digital audio interface, and then back to your headphones. And there's a slight delay if the latency is too big. As you can imagine, the term latency refers to the lateness of the sound. So again, it takes time for the audio to be put into the computer, have the computer process it, and then play it back to you. Now, this is only a big deal when you're recording because you want to not hear a subtle echo of what you are doing. You want to hear it as close to what you're doing as you can possibly get it. Otherwise, it's going to throw you a little bit. Now, to change the latency, we're going to change what's called the buffer size. And a buffer is like an envelope. And depending upon the size of the envelope, the amount of information that you can put in it can be greater or less. But if it's a larger envelope, it's going to take more time to put information into it and more time to take it out. So therefore, that's going to increase the latency. Whereas if it's a smaller envelope, and you're only putting a little bit of information in it, it takes less time to put it in and less time to take it out. However, to equal the same amount of material that goes in and out of the large envelope, your CPU has to work harder and faster. And if the buffer size is too small, you can get pops and clicks and dropouts where the audio actually stops. So let's look at the buffer size and how this will affect latency. So normally if I'm not recording and I'm just playing back audio, I've done my recording already, I will have my buffer size set to 1024 samples. And we can see that live tells us what our latency is going to be when we do that. The input latency is going to be 21.7 milliseconds, and the output will also be 21.7 milliseconds. So it's going to take 21.7 milliseconds to go into the computer and be analyzed, and then another 21.7 milliseconds to come out. The overall latency is going to be 43.3 milliseconds. And believe it or not, we can hear that. Most people can hear latency when it gets above 30 milliseconds. Some people, and depending upon what you're playing too, the actual instrument, some people can hear it when the latency is below 30 milliseconds. So what we can do is make the buffer smaller. And buffers are usually set in halves of certain sizes. So here, 1024, half of that is going to be 512. So if I set this down to 512, now my input and output latency have dropped to 11 milliseconds, and my overall latency is 22 milliseconds. Now again, depending upon the sensitivity of the person doing the recording and the instrument they're playing, for example, if the instrument has a really strong hard attack like a piano, you still might hear some subtle delay, some latency in the signal. In a flute, you might not hear that because a flute doesn't have a really hard attack. But if you're still hearing some latency, we can knock this down even lower. So again, 512 gets knocked down to 256. And now our overall latency is 11.3 milliseconds, very, very small time. And I would think that most people would not hear this. So for me, when I'm recording, if I want to completely eliminate latency as being an issue, I can go down to usually 256, and that'll be fine. It's never a problem for me. I rarely go down to 128, and I never go down to 64 and 32. Those are almost guaranteed to get the processor to overload and start the sound dropping out, getting pops and clicks, because it just can't keep up with it. Then when you're done recording, you don't have to worry about latency anymore because you're not recording, you're just playing back. So there's only the out and everything's coming at the same amount of time. We can put it back to 1024 and let our CPU relax a little bit. Okay, so that's a quick look at how to determine the sound quality of your audio. And in the next video, we're going to actually start to record something. See you in the next video.